Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenue. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for a discussion on the future of academic collaboration in Europe, entitled Competition versus Cooperation in Times of Crisis, Reimagining European Collaborations. Our discussion today will focus on how European university cooperation has evolved and is evolving in a volatile geopolitical context, what we might anticipate from the future, and how we can preserve and maintain international cooperation in these uncertain times. My name is Lucy Shackleton. I'm Head of Public Policy and Partnerships at UCL European Institute, and in a previous life, Head of European Engagement for Universities UK. So I'm delighted to be discussing and sharing this event with you this afternoon on a topic very close to my heart. It gives me great pleasure to be co-organizing this event with the French Embassy in the United Kingdom and with the British Council in France. I'm going to hand over in just a moment for more formal introductions from both Dr. Minha Pham and Dr. Catherine Sarako. But just while we're waiting, a couple of short housekeeping notes. First of all, our discussion will last about an hour and a half, so up until about 5:30 UK time. Our first speaker, Professor Alain Berhetz, who I will formally introduce in a moment, is joining us remotely with the rest of our speakers here in the UK. I'll ask both Professor Berhetz and Dr. Steiger to give 15 minutes worth of remarks before asking Dr. Vincent Carpentier and Professor Christine Mousselin to respond also on the basis of their rich academic expertise in this area. I'd encourage you to ask questions. For those of you joining online, please do use the Q&A function, not the chat. And you're also very welcome to use the tweet using the organizational Twitter handles that we displayed earlier on. In the interim, just to note that this session is being recorded and will be made available via the UCL European Institute website in the next couple of days. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over first to Dr. Catherine Sarako from the British Council in France for a brief introduction, and then to Dr. Minha Pham.
Thank you, Lucy. So good afternoon or good evening, ladies and gentlemen, according to where you are. A warm and huge welcome to all the community and to all the colleagues from higher education, and also to those who are joining online. So before we kick off, as it was reminded, some practical reminders. We have a Twitter handle, which is @UCL_EI. The session is being recorded and participants can ask questions live via the Q&A function on Zoom. I'm Catherine Sarako, Head of Education at the British Council France, and I'm truly delighted to introduce the part 2 of our ambassador on the new geopolitics of higher education and research with my colleague Minha Pham, Scientific Counselor at the French Embassy. From the very beginning, the policy dialogues are so-called flagship programs at the British Council France and have always been held in partnerships with key British academic partners, such as University of London Campus of Paris in 2021. And I'm very happy that we could partner with the UCL European Institute on this relevant and timely topic on the future of European academic collaboration in times of crisis. So a big thank you to UCL for hosting this event, and also to the organizers, Lucy Shackleton and Uta Steiger, but also to my colleagues from the Department for Science and Technology at the French Embassy, Minha Pham, Florence Ferrand, Damien Vial, who have been very instrumental in the conception and organization of these ambassadors. Before diving very briefly into the topic, I'd like to outline that we have been running this series of policy dialogues for 4 years now on key higher education topics, as always with the same ambition to stimulate the debate, to exchange best practices, and to bolster institutional ties for sustainable partnerships between France and the UK, but also beyond. We have worked twice with PSL, Paris Sciences et Lettres, and I do recall a very constructive debate we had in 2020 on the role of universities in fulfilling the SDGs. We have worked also with ESAM University on youth employability and the future of work, and lastly with Sciences Po Paris on this series. This subject on the new geopolitics of higher education has become paramount in a tense international context. This issue is wide-ranging and multifaceted. That's the reason why we use the plural, les nouvelles géopolitiques de l'enseignement supérieur et de la recherche, as obviously there are several geopolitical issues arising that reshuffle the cards and completely reorganize the dynamics of science diplomacy. So I think we all assume that it will be an ongoing conversation moving forward. On February 24, we launched the part 1 with Sciences Po Paris by focusing on the Sino-American rivalry and its impact on student mobility and scientific collaboration. We touched on academic and technological sovereignty and the fundamental values that must be preserved: citizenship, plurality of opinions, democracy, autonomy, and open sciences. The question around competition versus cooperation was already brought to the fore, and one of the main conclusions was that since a global science has emerged as a system beyond the states themselves, efforts and strategies should be geared towards cooperation. Today, we are looking at European academic collaborations, their place, impact, and strategies compared to big players like the US and China, but also their role in Europe, where political tension have surfaced. We are also facing unprecedented societal challenges: climate change, of course, technological sovereignty, gender equality, health and well-being, misinformation, and many others, which untackled could create additional divides. Many issues will be discussed today, in particular, the European University Initiative, which since 2019 is a real game changer in bringing together European universities sharing the same values and ambitions and being test beds for transnational cooperation. I'd like now to conclude by saying that in times of geopolitical tensions, there is a heightened need for international academic collaboration, which is critical to tackle common challenges. European alliances have definitely a huge part to play, and their underpinning training, research, innovation model is very promising, even though there are still challenges around common governance structures, joint European degrees, accreditation, etc. I'm sure that our panelists today will contribute to a fruitful debate and provide us with key insights on this question. Among them, I'd like to highlight 3 which are particularly sensitive. Are we heading towards the EU strategic autonomy? And if so, how is that going to play out with global science? What will be the effect on international cooperation? Will academic freedom be curbed? And how will scientific diplomacy evolve? I shall end here my introduction, and on behalf of the British Council, I'm really delighted to open the floor to the discussion today. And without further ado, I hand over to Mina Pham. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Catherine, for this few words of introduction. So myself, my name is Mina Pham. I'm the current Counselor for Science and Technology at the French Embassy in London. And as it has been said, the topic of this meeting is particularly timely, especially as French representative, since you all know that the French presidency of the EU Council at the moment is President Macron. And also, I would like to remind you that France and Germany have initiated the creation of the Alliances of European Universities. And of course, we will probably discuss about it in a few moments. But today, in the context of post-Brexit, the future of these consortia and more generally of collaboration, academic collaboration between French and British universities is questioned in terms of the partnerships. As the Department of Science and Technology of the French Embassy, we are especially concerned by keeping our bilateral and European research collaborations running. And it's very reassuring to see that in all our discussions with either French or British academic partners, there is a strong will to keep on working together. And UCL is among these partners. Now, the challenge is to find the right tools and the appropriate funding schemes to support this collaboration at the national, European, and international levels. One of the first steps to face this situation and its impact on higher education and research collaboration is to analyze the opportunities and constraints. And today's conversation will allow to hear from experts in higher education research, European and international collaboration, including in these times of crisis. I would like to value the excellent partnership we have with our partner, the British Council, here represented by Catherine, not only in the organization of such dialogue, but also for other joint schemes and strategic thoughts about the future of collaboration in our joint common field. I would like also to acknowledge the partnership we built with UCL European Institutes for this event, but not only, and especially to Lucy Shackleton, who has been instrumental to prepare and host this meeting. And I would like to associate my team at the Higher Education Research and Innovation Department, Florence Ferrand, Damien Vial, and also Elise Martin, who strongly committed themselves in the organization of this event. Finally, I would like to warmly thank our experts from France, Alain Berhetz, coming soon, Christine Musselin, and also from UCL, who will share their views, UCL with Uta Steiger and Vincent Carpentier, who will share their views in a moment. So with further ado, I give you back the floor, Lucy.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I'm going to pass straight over to Professor Alain Berhetz, who is, of course, president of the Cost Association, which many of you will know very well. And couldn't be a better person, I think, to understand and unpick the challenges and opportunities facing European higher education today. Briefly, Professor Alain Berhetz was elected president of the Cost Association in June 2021. From 2018 to 2020, he was also the special envoy of the French Prime Minister on the European Universities Initiative. From September 2016 to September 2018, he was Director General of Research and Innovation at the French Ministry of Higher Education, Research and Innovation. And prior to this, he was both the president of the University of Strasbourg, as well as the chair of the League of European Research Universities, which of course UCL is also a member of. He's also a professor emeritus at the University of Strasbourg. Professor Berhetz, thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucy. Hello, everybody. And first, my apologies for not being physically with you. I would have really loved to be back at UCL, but just couldn't make it. But let's do it some other time. Thank you again for the invitation. Thank you to the British Council, to the French Embassy, and of course to UCL and the Europe Center at UCL for this honor. So I've been given 15 minutes to speak to you about the reimaging academic cooperation in those times of crisis. Of course, it will be not a complete view. It will be a very personal one. And I hope also that I can fuel the discussion that will happen later this afternoon or tomorrow. In this spirit, I will take maybe 3 examples coming actually from my own experience in the University of Strasbourg. Let me just get my text back on the screen. It will be easier for me. And it will bring me, I guess, maybe 2-3 milestones. The University of Strasbourg was created, it's not as old as many British universities. It was created in the 16th century and was part of the fantastic intellectual movement of the Rhine Valley during the Renaissance. Rhine Valley from Basel all the way up to Amsterdam. And Erasmus was a very common host at the University of Strasbourg. What I want to point out is that at that time already, no students nor professors were ever staying in the same university. And so my first milestone is there. A university really lives through its international networks. Now, the second milestone goes 3 centuries later, 1871, when France lost the Prussian War. Alsace and its capital Strasbourg became German and became as a part of a German empire actually for 50 years. And to show its power, to celebrate its victory, the German Kaiser, to show how better the Reich was than France, what did the German Kaiser do? He built a university in Strasbourg. It was the only imperial university outside of Berlin. He hired the best young scientists from all Germany. He put a lot of his personal money in the pot, and this led to more than 10 Nobel Prizes in 50 years. And so my second milestone is clearly a university can be a political beacon, but it should not compromise on academic quality. And my third milestone is more than a century later, in 1989, so 33 years ago already. It was a date of founding of the European Confederation of Upper Rhine Universities that we call EUCOR. The members are universities of Basel, of Freiburg and Karlsruhe, and of Mulhouse and Strasbourg, sorry. And in 2013, we voted the creation of a, quote, European campus. It was inaugurated by Carlos Moedas in 2016. Carlos was at the time the commissioner for research. This milestone is there to show that university can indeed decide to build new bridges. In our case on the River Rhine, but the River Rhine is very symbolic because it was still showing the scars of past bloody conflicts. And so it comes back also to the spirit of Erasmus. Why did I want maybe to speak about those three anecdotes? I merely wanted to stress 3 points which are important in your goal today, reimagining European academic cooperation. The first is that we have lessons from the past to take. I will cite Marc Bloch. He's a famous alumni from our university, and he said in French, l'incompréhension du présent naît fatalement de l'ignorance du passé, which could be possibly translated as the misunderstanding of the present is surely born of ignorance of the past. The second lesson is that bottom-up dynamics are fruitful. When we call this transnational network the European campus, we were fueled by a profound and sincere European spirit, but we did not suspect that this could spark other initiatives. And the third lesson is that although we all cherish academic freedom, we have to realize that universities are in the real world, and they are also submitted to political issues. So if we want to succeed in our academic enterprises, we cannot ignore those political issues. I will try to illustrate these points with 2 examples, the European universities and then the threat of sovereignty policies on universities. So first, European universities. You will have a special session on this tomorrow, so consider this also maybe as a small introduction. And I will, of course, not cover the whole field, which is quite complex. The concept of European university is not new, but there was a turning point in the speech of Emmanuel Macron in the Sorbonne in 2017. This subject of European universities was tiny in the speech, a few sentences in an hour and a half of speech, but it had a fantastic impact, probably because this vision was embedded into a more ambitious European agenda. The European Universities Alliances are now taken as a proxy of innovative international collaboration. I want to ask the question, is this really true? And I will try just to point out a few challenges that the concept is facing, and you can discuss this afternoon or tomorrow. Let's cut the notion in pieces. First, in European universities, what does the word universities mean? A university, any university, walks on 3 legs: research, education, and service to society, which includes innovation. Otherwise, it can be a research organization or higher education institution, but it's not a university. However, at present, the European Universities Alliances are totally limping because they only walk on the education leg. If we just cut the word again, what is European in a European university? First, is it one global supranational university? In other words, is it a change of scale? Or two, is it a place to develop new functions and strategies which are not available to national universities? In other words, is it a change of purpose? Well, maybe it's a mixture of these two. Anyway, a successful European university should be different. Different in scale, different in depth, different in quality, and different in achievements. Then, what is a European University Alliance? What does this alliance mean? Remember that in the beginning they were called networks, not alliances. But these clusters of universities are not networks. A network is used for communication. An alliance brings added value. You do together things that you could not do alone. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. A European university should bring academic and political value added compared to a national university system, just like the ERC is doing for research. Well, of course, there are many open questions which can be raised on the concept of European universities. These issues are not specific to the European universities, but actually apply to all academic cooperation, so they deserve to be shortly cited now. First issue, the issue of diversity versus top-down planning. You do not program, you know that. You don't program universities top-down. You provide them with tools and then you let them work. And the EU program has up to now shown a high degree of creativity from the stakeholders. It is critical to let them continue to build on that. We have to invest trust in universities as much as money. The other issue is the issue of sustainable funding versus calls for projects. Up to now, it's a call for project. Many European universities have asked for some kind of sustainable funding. And this is an important issue, but it cannot be achieved without clear commitments from the member states, not just the European Union. There is also the issue of excellence versus widening. There is a great challenge to consider both excellence and widening at the same time. And probably the European universities could go for what I often call inclusive excellence. But we really also have to consider the non-politically correct creation of world-class, excellent European universities. Finally, we do not stress enough the political importance of European universities alliances. Because I believe, and from the history, from the Middle Age, from the Renaissance, universities were historically a building block of Europe. European universities alliances are not a goal for academics alone. They should also become a cornerstone for the building of the future of Europe. And European universities are a challenge for Europe, but also for the member states. One cannot expect that Europe brings all the value added and all the money, by the way. Saying more bluntly, European universities cannot be the cure for the failure of some member states to build modern universities. It would only be, as we say in French, a band-aid on a wooden leg. This is a free translation, but I hope you will understand what I mean. Now, I will go quickly to my second and last point, the impact of politics on academic cooperation. We are really living in special times, the climate crisis, the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, etc. And this all fits with the famous quote of Lenin that you know very well. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. In the history of universities, we have often looked down at political issues, putting forward the assumption that universities should not be directly dependent on political issues. However, the war in Ukraine shows that we are part of the game, both as citizens and academics. When the Russian war effort is backed by Russian academic institutions, we cannot just stand still. But we also know that many academics and students oppose the war, and then international relationships are vital for them. There is a strong debate on this matter. I won't have time to summarize it. My only point here is that academics cannot just consider that this is not an issue. I can remind a British audience of a quote I found by Winston Churchill that he said in 1923, and I quote, "There is always a strong case for doing nothing, especially for doing nothing yourself." So let's not do this. If universities want to prove that they are major actors of Europe's future, they should accept to be actors of European politics, but with their own tools and specific values. The European Council meeting in March has set key policy targets for Europe: bolstering defense capacities, reducing dependence on energy from elsewhere, building a more robust economy base. And the word sovereignty is on top of the list. Now, will this quest for autonomy have an impact on research and innovation? Will ideas and persons circulate as well as before? One positive consequence of this attitude could be that Europe would consider that one of the main tools to achieve this autonomy, this independence, this sovereignty is higher education and research. For this, they should increase significantly the investment in these fields. Unfortunately, we don't see it coming. So there is a more pessimistic point of view that if there is no budget increase, this new policy, the policies, the priorities of this new policy will come at the detriment of existing commitments. In this scenario, there is a big risk, for example, for blue sky research or non-technological domains. But more generally, what will be the effects on academic cooperation? Will strategic priorities conflict with open science? Will more research and innovation activities find themselves subject to export control regulations? Will academic diplomacy still exist? Will academic freedom be curbed? Well, maybe it's time to remember the spirit of the Kaiser when he created the Imperial University in Strasbourg. He invested in universities for the future. He did not try to plan the future. As a conclusion, I want to come back to another speech by Macron. I'm not speaking for Macron, be reassured, but I think he spoke a lot about Europe compared to other French leaders, by the way. In Strasbourg, 1 week ago exactly, a pragmatic Macron called for the creation of a European political community to allow European nations to find a new space for cooperation. He said that the Ukraine crisis has demonstrated that we need a wider circle, and they cited the number of 35 members. This debate on a multi-tiered Europe has been going on for decades. Coalitions of the willing could be formed around different policy areas, including higher education and research. However, we should acknowledge the usual problems associated with this type of issues, a kind of Europe à la carte, or the creation of second-class memberships, etc. And of course, some areas cannot afford compromise or disunity, for example, in the case of Europe's international standing. This multi-tiered approach is worth considering in the academic field. This is already the case for at least 2 institutions that I know of: the Council of Europe, which is also in Strasbourg, by the way, with its 46 members and dealing a lot with academic issues. And the other one is COST, which I'm presiding at the moment, funded by the EU, but spans to the limits of Europe with 40 members. To conclude, I really want to say I'm a European optimist. I strongly believe that universities have been and will be a major building block for strong Europe. However, neither in the State of Union speech by President Ursula von der Leyen, nor in the Serment de Strasbourg speech by Emmanuel Macron last week, there is not the single time the word university in those 2 major speeches, not a single time. Even if they have insisted on progress on research and technology, using the COVID vaccine as an example, but this is yielding a very utilitarian view for our university. So let me conclude with a sentence by Robert Schuman from 1950. I quote, "World peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it. The contribution which an organized and living Europe can bring to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations," end of quote. These prophetic words have become reality, but they sound a little bit strange in the current dramatic European situation. I am personally convinced that universities can be one of the main tools to achieve Robert Schumann's view and goal, but we still have a long way to go. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed for that fascinating set of insights. I'm going to pass the floor directly to my colleague, Dr. Ute Steiger, who is both Executive Director of the UCL European Institute, but also the Vice Provost at UCL for Europe, a strategic position shaping the university's engagement with the continent. Her academic research sits at the intersection of modern European thought, culture, and politics, with her most recent open access edited volume, Brexit and Beyond, Rethinking the Futures of Europe, the press's second most accessed publication. Ute is also a member of the Russell Group EU Advisory Board and the Advisory Board of the Scottish Council on European Relations, a senior fellow at the Centre of Britain and Europe at the University of Sussex, and a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. Ute, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and it's a pleasure to be here today, and a bit of a daunting task to follow that wonderful first opener, particularly the spread of historical references and quotes, which I'm afraid I may not be able to quite match. But as you heard just from very briefly from Lucy's introduction, as you can see, professionally, I have sort of Europe written all over me, and personally too, I suppose. My family of 4 owns a total of 10 passports from 3 European nationalities, and we speak 4 European languages to each other. So in many ways, you could say I have a very significant interest in everything that's Europe. But if you're less kind, you'd say I have a vested interest too. So today is a very apt occasion for me to talk about that intersection of the personal and the professional that Europe represents for me. Now, all of you have enough background and expertise in the topic, otherwise you wouldn't be here. So I'm not going to try and convince you of the merits and the importance of cross-border collaboration in the sciences in Europe. We all are aware just how much positive impact it brings, both in the quality, the reach and impact of research, how it supports both the status and the productivity often of the mobile researcher, and the career prospects, as well as personal development of our students. So I'm not going to cite all of that at you. I think we're all agreed in principle on this. But I think what we have seen is that despite international research collaboration in Europe really thriving, and governments and transnational organizations and funders recognizing the importance, the challenges that we're facing at the moment, and maybe probably since the last 5 years at the very least, are very sort of substantial indeed. And I think it's worth looking in some more detail at this. And I think the header of today around collaboration versus competition gives us a very good angle on this. So I want to very briefly sketch where we are now. As you know, I just heard I have an interest in Brexit matters as part of my job to help the university prepare for it. But also, if I speak here as on behalf of a UK university, it is obviously an overriding issue for us, how the future of academic collaboration with the EU member states will look like going forward. So within the context of a really budding and flowering international research collaboration, Europe remains and in fact the largest and fastest growing of our partners to the UK universities. So scientifically, it is the continent, the region we work with most, if I now separate us out in some ways. More than a third of UK research papers are actually co-authored with other EU and associated countries, compared with only about 17.5% for the USA. And interestingly, so those of you who followed Brexit matters, on the trade issue as well, in trade, it tends to be said that geographical proximity is a huge matter for the prospects of further trade integration. And I suppose for research, some argument can be made for that as well. At UCL, you could say that Europe is really part of our DNA, quite literally. We have over 2,000 European collaborative partners. Over 3,000 of our staff are European citizens, and over 6,000 of them, of our students, are so too. We've got some of the highest number of European students among our cohorts. And we really have been, throughout those past few years, very vocally active in trying to maintain and deepen our links to European higher education institutions, and obviously further abroad, despite the challenges thrown at us. Without sort of singing our praises too much, but it's true that the UK sector as a whole did extremely well under Horizon 2020, just as the other country, Switzerland, the third country currently outside the program. The UK was a top 5 collaborator for 25 out of the 27 other member states, and that is saying quite something. And collaboration with the UK has also been shown to increase the impact and influence of EU science activity. So in so many ways, the UK has benefited hugely from membership, and so has the rest of Europe as well. Now, like Switzerland, at least publicly, the UK continues to be committed to associating to Horizon Europe. And obviously the ball is not in our court, but the European Commission's court at the moment. But unlike Switzerland, and not entirely surprising, perhaps given the UK's history and also general policy preferences, we may be seeing a shift away from that kind of collaboration towards an idea of competition, or certainly competition with European partners. In UK discourse, in fact, and I've been, sort of tracking that for quite some time, very often you see Europe as being set up something that's different from global. So if UK politicians talk about a global Britain, they very often mean that bit of the globe that's not Europe. Whereas my argument around is always to say that's all very good and in fact also very necessary. Yet, can Europe please remain an important part of that? The biggest hot potato here, of course, is Horizon and the research framework programs of the European Union. And the longer uncertainty remains, the more the weight is shifting towards what we call Plan B. So as I said, the government obviously is committed to association, but it can't wait forever and it has to plan. And the more it's planning, the more interested people come and become in the ideas of what you could do if you were to design the whole thing from scratch. And by their very existence, such alternative schemes would effectively be competing with Horizon Europe. Certainly also collaborating in some instances, but even where they are going to be designed very differently, an element of competition will begin to seep in where collaboration tended to rule. And I think a particular case here is for the European Research Council. At the moment, at UCL at least, practically all ERC grantees who were given the grants in this transition period have decided to stay at UCL, even should their grant no longer be funded by the ERC, but underwritten by UKRI. That actually is quite a big vote of confidence into the UK sector, but we don't know what the future would hold and would future applicants go down that route. So in order to attract the best and brightest, I think ERC, which is the one model that the UK is likely to seek to replicate here, would by its very nature end up in competition with the ERC. And similarly in the area of student mobility, so the Turing program really is a really welcome investment in, and also allows us a new experimental forms of student mobility. And we're very grateful also that that's financial investment has now been extended for another 3 years, giving us some sort of planning stability. It's also in line with UCL's really drastic ambition to have at least 30% of its undergraduates have some form of international experience as part of their degree. But of course, as most of you will know, the Turing program also lacks the reciprocity required for mobility. So it requires a bilateral form of an agreement with partners in Europe, underwritten, however, by only a unilateral funding commitment. And that's a really qualitative change in the way that we've perceived collaboration so far. It also really remains to be seen how we are meant to honor our existing commitments to students who go on their compulsory year abroad as part of their degree, and which have previously been funded by Erasmus, and at the same time continue to develop new forms and diversify our partnerships for mobility. While we're on Erasmus, a different lesson we're learning is from the European University Alliances initiatives. Now, many UK universities, including UCL, chose not to participate in one of those alliances when they were originally launched. There's lots of reasons. Part of the reason may have been timing. Part of it may be the peculiarity of the higher education system here, which makes transferring credits from one UK institution to another already much of a headache. Try now that with several other universities in other countries. But obviously also there was a part of skepticism towards the aims and ambitions of the original network and the long-term benefits of the scheme. Now, I'm not in the position to judge whether that decision was right or not. The lesson I want to draw from it is the experience that a significant level of institutional and also individual trust just builds up between higher education institutions, forced to spend an inordinate amount of time working out just how different they are from each other and how best to overcome those differences to establish a common project. Or to put it in different terms, there's a lot of sunk cost involved in creating long-term big partnerships of this kind, that undoing them is inefficient, but also with financial and human resources being quite constrained, the capacity for additional collaborative schemes with partners who are not part of that alliance becomes more costly and also much more difficult. So outside of both Erasmus and Horizon and these networks for UK universities, partnerships with higher education institutions outside Europe may well increase over time. But I think it's also worth stressing that the governments worldwide really are adopting a more politicized approach to science and technology and research policy. Some maybe with a more protectionist approach to international collaboration amid concerns, for example, around intellectual property or academic freedom. And so navigating those partnerships with other countries, some of them have with very different political systems and values, has become a real focus for our policymakers, so within Europe and abroad. And as we are, I think, all too aware, we've had two of the biggest exogenous shocks really to have hit our sector, as it's hit pretty much all of politics and society, which are having a really long-term impact on the future of our global engagement strategies. And one is, of course, the lessons that we can learn from the pandemic, about how and what we can teach to our students, how important in-person versus virtual forms of mobility are, and what the limits and opportunities are to virtually conducted research. So we've had a massive learning curve in these areas that will change the way we cooperate and compete. Second, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has also made universities in Europe and beyond both sever at incredibly immense speed very long-standing ties with partners in the Russian Federation, and at equally immense speed conceive of new schemes that host displaced students and scholars, twin with Ukrainian universities, or otherwise offer support as best we can. I really hope that the crisis response mode, which seems to have governed University International's priorities for the past 5 years, do come to an end at some stage. But that means we look forward more strategically speaking, and we have to ask ourselves what that future might look like. So with a final note to that, to say that I think particularly from a UK perspective, it is and remains important to affirm the importance of intra-European collaboration as well as understand from a pragmatic point of view that it's really through collaboration, through economies of scale, and a really truly multilateral approach that European science will remain competitive, also in the face of obviously ever bigger competition, for example, from Southeast Asia. My hunch is that bilateral initiatives, which we've established over time, really will see themselves strengthened, certainly in the midterm, as we await further developments on European and also domestic collaboration funding. So examples from UCLs and partners across Europe include things like Alliance for Tech, which was a European campus without borders that we have with Centrale Supélec in Paris, Politecnico di Milano, and TU Berlin, and which preceded by a long shot the university networks. The really wonderful collaboration that's beginning to take place with the INRIA London program, for example, the dual degree we have with Sciences Po in European Social and Political Thought, or Max Planck UCL Center for Computational Psychology. I could go on, which I wouldn't, you'll be glad to know. But I think important in the context is that those strategies, which are independent in principle of multilateral funding, have become vehicles for us in order to deepen and really enhance strategic cooperation with individual institutions that would sort of safeguard us from a wider political environment, at the same time as just promising a very, very focused collaboration over the years. I also want to mention that we devised a program at UCL that wanted to spend prime funding for bilateral research and teaching initiatives, but with a wide web of regional stakeholders, and through what we call the Cities Partnerships Program, which is piloted with Rome, Paris, and Stockholm. So we've tried to innovate a form of both bilateral and yet somehow network regional cooperation that would allow us to increase a narrowed focus, but across faculties and disciplines in a particular region in Europe. Best practices of this kind are obviously driven at institutional levels and are different from the sort of systemic and transnational arrangements that we've discussed before. But we have to work through a sector level network such as LIRU and the European Universities Association to make the case continuously to both our national governments, but also to the EU, for why international collaboration matters, and also to negotiate at the same time new bilateral arrangements that allow us to for those bilateral relationships to continue in the event of non-association. So we drive a sort of parallel card, if you like. I think I'm probably well over time now, but I think what I just wanted to end with is that I think it's important that we both hope that EU science and research policy continues to evolve in a global and outward-facing direction that maintains a strong emphasis on excellence and blue sky research funding, on innovation in teaching and research, possibly above and beyond, but that's my personal view, identity and value-based considerations. Just as we must hope at the same time that the UK government becomes more willing over time to engage with EU-led innovations in a less politicized manner and see them as part of the global visions that they represent. As someone who's taught and published on European integration matters, I think I do understand the difficulties of the trust that is being breached around the protocol and why that leads to a hold-up in association. I understand also what Professor Berhetz now said about the importance of universities helping build a European consciousness. And yet at the same time, I worry about that difference between shaping and building a political community. And what would it look like if all of a sudden UKRI turned around and told us in our collaboration that we should think particularly about building a future UK polity and identity. Those sort of worries have played up in Brexit. I remember very clearly the time when a Tory MP shortly after the referendum wrote to all universities asking to see our syllabus where we're teaching EU matters and Brexit matters. that was rebuffed, but it was a sign of political encroachment, perhaps, on the task of universities that should remain separate. But that is an area for discussion, and I shall leave it at that for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move us on in about 20 minutes to open discussion and questions and answers. So do think about questions that you might want to pose to our panelists from now onwards. But before I do that, we're very fortunate to have two leading academic experts in the field of higher education and research, both Professor Christine Musselat and Dr. Vincent Carpentier here with us. I'm going to ask them each to provide sort of 10 minutes worth of reflections on the basis of the keynotes that we've just heard. Professor Christine Musselat, if you'd like to go first, you're a CNRS full research professor and lecturer at Centre de Sociologie des Organisations. Your research focuses on universities with a particular interest in what characterizes their governance and various French government initiatives, including excellence initiatives. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the invitation to participate to this panel. Maybe there are some points I would like to just put on the table in order to develop the conversation. We heard a lot about cooperation, but not so much about competition in the previous, even if you put much more competition maybe than Alain in your talk. But I would like to come back to this idea of competition and maybe stress one or two points. The first one is that we observed for sure an increase in competition in the last decades. And the drivers for this increase in competition is not something which is a natural phenomenon just popping up, you know. It's, from my point of view, led by two main drivers. The first one are private actors, and I'm thinking of Google, for instance, or at Web of Science and so on, because we have much more data on academics. We can provide indicators and rank academics, labs, and institutions. And that's something which really developed in the last decades. And one of the results for that has been that institutions which were not so much in competition before are more and more in competition one with another. So I would say that nations and academics have been used to competition for a long time, but institutions are really behaving as competitors not so for so many time now. And that's one thing I wanted to stress, because we spoke a lot about institutions here, much more than about academics themselves or nations, and I will come back to this point. The second drivers for this increase in competitions are governments. They developed a lot of instruments in order to increase competition among academics, among institutions, among the research labs. And this competition is much more equipped than it was before. And the results of this competition are much more visible. And this also increased the level of competition and the sense of competition. And I think that's something that has to be in our mind. But this competition also created more cooperation. And that's something which is always going one with another. There is no competition without some forms of sociability, and the very well-known sociologist Georg Simmel showed that many years ago. If you want to compete, you have to know your competitors, and so you have to develop social relations with them too. And you can see that again through different mechanisms. And one of them is what I call elective alliances. For me, the Russell Group is a perfect example for that. U15 in Germany, or the UDIS in France, which is the network of the excellent French universities, or at the EU level, you have the Leroux, but of course the Guild and many others. And here, it's a very interesting process through which institutions considering themselves as leading institutions, if you go on the websites of these alliances, you can always find the word leading institution. You know, that's so they consider themselves as leading institutions, so they bring themselves together. And what are they doing? They're not really cooperating, they are lobbying. They develop information, they exchange information. They also provide advices, or they say what they would like higher education to be. And they are quite important, I would say, in many countries, and they are more and more present, I would say. That's something which is really based on self-election. You know, you decide that you are part of it, and it's really status and reputation based. Along that, you have also public policies aiming at developing cooperation within higher education. We had it in France with the what we called, there were many words. Let's take the last one, which was commu. The commu were consortium of universities getting together because they were on the same territory and trying to develop cooperation. So yeah, that was one experience. You have also that in Germany for the last excellence initiative. It was possible for alliances. It's always the same term, you know, alliances, but it doesn't mean all the time the same thing. But that was also called alliances in Germany. They could apply for the excellence program, the excellence strategy in Germany. But you also see that at the EU level. We could see it through the research programs because with the collaborative projects, you are asked to put many different research teams together in order to develop a research program. And you can see it also, I think, with the European Universities Alliances. Again, you have a kind of political will to bring together academics or institutions and to ask them to cooperate. I must say that I'm quite skeptical about this kind of policies because they are, of course, based on bottom-up initiative in the sense that you're not obliged to cooperate with someone. But as you mentioned, Uta, in your speech, there is a lot of cost of transactional cost of transactions in this kind of settings. And something which has not been really discussed up to now is also how do you govern this kind of structure? Who is responsible for it? How do you make decisions together? The rationales behind that are also to be questioned, I think, because as you mentioned, in research, there are many potential cooperation. And how do you manage specific cooperation within this kind of structure with the natural cooperation that you want to develop as an academic? So here there is a kind of tension too that should be also mentioned. So a lot of more competition, but also new forms of cooperation, some of them really coming really from bottom up. And here I think of the many mergers we had in France, and Alain could speak of his experience and his role in developing this kind of merger in France, but also this kind of policy-made cooperation, which probably have to be discussed and to be questioned. And another thing I would like to stress is whether this kind of cooperation can really help building a European research area or a European higher education area. And here I have some doubt because I think it doesn't tackle the main problem we have in building this kind of area. We try to do it for so many years, without the UK now. I'm sorry about that, but nevertheless, it remains a big issue in Europe. And I think that one of the reasons why there are many reasons, but one of them is again competition. When I look at the policies developed by the different European countries, they are always trying to become the best in the world competition. The reforms which are led, they are never led with the idea of building Europe or a European research area or a European higher education area. They are always led in order to be the best in the world. That's what I hear in France when we develop the PIA, the Programme d'Initiative je sais plus ce que veut dire le PIA, or in Germany when they develop the Excellence Initiative, the aim is not Europe. And I think that's something that should be really much more on the table. How can we bring together our different systems? And if I can have 2 more minutes, I think that one important way to develop more cooperation within Europe will really be to modify our management of academic careers and to much more harmonize, if I can use this word, the different systems so that we consider that, so that academics consider that the normal space in which they develop is Europe and not only their national country. A last word about internationalization and what will happen with internationalization with the recent new geopolitics we are facing right now. I'm not sure that much will change because, as you mentioned, most of the relationships in terms of research, and I was attending a conference on internationalization of research 2 weeks ago in Sweden, they showed that the main relationships are between the US, or let's say North America, UK, France, Germany, let's say Europe. And it's true that science is much more polycentric than it has been in the past, and we can see it on many indicators. But nevertheless, the main bulk of the relationships are still there. So I'm not sure these relationships will be really threatened. But what might happen would be that other centers will develop isolated from Europe or from the US, so that we could have much more different circles of cooperation in the world. And I won't, as I said, I'm not sure that it will change something for the European, but that there will be much more changes in other parts of the world with new forms of relationships from which we will be more excluded than we are now. But yeah, that's for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Dr. Vincent Carpentier, who's reader in History of Education at the IRE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to discuss this very important topic with you. So I just wanted to make like a few points in relation to what the previous speaker has been said, and I think I will like make some connection with some key ideas which I think have been the idea of the political role of university. I always say university and higher education institution. I mean, I guess we say university, but it's we can see a broader term as well in building identity, national identity, and European identity in that case, as Alain Berhetz noted in this presentation. The other thing that I can I get from I would say most presentation is the idea that structures matter in a way, and that's I believe that in the case of Brexit, like Uta just discussed, that you have to reconstruct like some kind of structure that will have an impact on the practices and the policies and what you do, and this idea of whether you go towards like a movement of cooperation or competition. So this tension between the two for me is important. I think, as Christine said, I mean, and I think HE is competition is part of HE, in some way of research, but cooperation is a very key. I think one can't work without the others, or with if it's not the case, there would be like some potential negative implications in relation to that. So I just want to make like a few points because that's my probably historical lens, and talking about the Franco-Prussian War, all this like this key idea and turning point. And I was thinking about the title of this event and the idea of crisis, which I researched quite a lot in some ways. So I got inspired by that, which is a bit probably sad, but that's. I was thinking first that it is a key crisis at the moment. We've got like some really interrelated challenges at the economic, political, social, and geopolitical levels that are very important. And I had 2 points in relation to that. Is first, there's been crisis before. For example, I study Kondratiev cycles, which are like economic cycles, and you had like some huge like turmoil in the world and Europe in the 1830s, 1870s, 1930s, as we know it, and 1970s, and 2008 more recently, and all of them had a huge impact on higher education, in some ways, and led to some important reform and some questioning about this idea of collaboration or competition in some ways. The point I would like to make in relation to that is I think this crisis is really critical for a number of reasons, and I co-edited a book with Alain Berhetz, who is a professor at UCL as well, on in 2010. We started writing it in 2008, so in the middle of the financial crisis, and we developed this idea of higher education, or the world being in the middle of a tetralemma, which is four forces that we need to put together in some ways. That was the economy in some way, equity and inequality. The third was sustainability, and the other one was democracy. And the question there was like, how do you pull together these kind of forces that can be, and sometimes competing in some ways? And my point in relation to that, emphasizing the needs for cooperation, is clear, because we are at a critical point where all these forces 12 years after are, have been like increasingly challenged, environment, geopolitical tension, democracy, inequality, and still an economic fragile system. So the environment represents an existential threat as well, that makes us think that we need to think about really developing this collaboration in some ways. But we probably need to change as well, probably the way we balance cooperation and competition in some ways. COVID-19 opened some kind of opportunities, maybe to reflect on these kind of changes in some ways. I think it has shown the key role of higher education, in terms of responding to global challenge, but also the need for cooperation at the same time. But at the same time, higher education has been like heavily criticized sometimes. So there is a kind of that's my response to the idea of crisis and reimagining, and we need to do that now in some ways. That's a difference between probably the 1870s and 90s period. The other point I would like to make, and I would stop there, is in relation to this competition, cooperation kind of dynamics. There's two things, according to me, and but I mean, there's more things, but two things came to my mind after the presentation. Is first, we need kind of like cooperation and collaboration between globally engaged institutions that think about their respective HE systems as well. So that's the question of differentiation within each system as well. And I think collaboration should be based on this kind of adequation, because the global, the national, and the local in that sense. And that's what like 2008 revealed, and the backlash against higher education provoked in some way. So I think that's one of the important things, that academic collaboration should be about developing Europe, developing global cosmopolitan society, let's say, but also to think about how you could, through this collaboration, transform the differentiation of higher education system nationally in a good direction in some ways. So that means, I think the European universities have addressed that by talking about inclusivity and the idea that students should reflect their population. There's maybe some way as well to think about how this collaboration can integrate like different kind of institutions at different in different level in the hierarchy as well. The second point, which is linked to that one, is I think, and Alain Berhetz talked about that, but the idea of resources. There is a need to revive public funding at national level and institutional level as well, in order to address the textualism I was talking about, but also to make sure that this collaboration leads to this idea of social justice I just mentioned. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got 20 minutes now until we close, so ample opportunity for questions, comments, and discussion with the audience, both in person and remotely. Just a reminder, do pose your questions on the Q&A function if you're joining us remotely, as the chat won't be monitored. We've got roving mics here today, so please do use that. Tell us who you are, where you come from, and if your question is addressed to anybody. First of all, gentlemen up there.
Thank you very much. My name is Anselm Heinrich. I'm Professor of Theatre Studies and International Dean at the College of Arts at the University of Glasgow. Uta, you've been very cautious, I thought, in your introduction there, and almost sounded like a politician in terms of being quite careful not to criticize the UK government. For me, this Turing scheme is imperial. This idea of we send you our students, but we are not taking your students. I think this is a huge mistake and a catastrophe, really. So I just wanted to say this is just a comment on a question, but I thought it was something you may be thinking, but you were not saying. Thank you.
Do you want me to answer that?
Please.
So yeah. I'll try and make an actual point in my answer rather than say yes or no to us. We may all have different preferences of where political decisions had gone in the last few years, but we're also at the same time working with political reality. So there's a huge issue in Turing around the lack of mobility, the reciprocal mobility. That's the single biggest thing. And we made that point to Bayes, we made that point several times with several interlocutors. But I have to say, at least there's something, because at a time of restricted funding and a lot of competition for funding pots, this government has at least pledged an increase in science and research budget and also has put money towards it. So I'm careful indeed about, because things could have gone very differently. What I hope we can do is make the case and also show empirically what it means, that the goals they have set themselves, which is particularly goals of widening participation, where language is no longer language learning no longer one of the biggest issues. It's not about placements, of engaging with other nations abroad, that it won't actually probably lead to the fulfillment of those capacities if you don't bring in the reciprocal element. That's one thing. And the other is the hope that over time, that sort of policy sensitivity we've got at the moment, that everything that's related with Europe is by necessity political and not to be touched with a barge pole. And, because obviously everybody speaking on behalf of Europe must by definition be a remoter. And you can imagine with my triple Europe and my triple job title, that's been an interesting experience. I do want to show that I also understand the constraints people are under who now occupy those positions, in the sense that we need to engage with governance structures. Doesn't mean that we hold back when we think it needs vast improvement. But I shall leave it at that, I think.
I have a question for you, Christine, because you have been quite challenging in your talk about building the European era that is, well, I think we are more or less the same generation, and this was very important at the beginning of our careers. That was really the goal. And now you're right, we don't hear about it anymore, not as much as we did in the past. And I'm interested in what you said about having European careers. I think that many of us have international backgrounds. You mentioned 4 languages, etc. But after spending some time abroad, when you come back to your country, you see that everything about your career happens in your country, the awards, yeah. And when you go away, people just forget about you. And when you come back, you have no room for you. There is no room for you anymore. So this is something that probably people like us who are in charge could try to change, but it's not that easy. And also, I think that having these careers, in a way, we have to try bringing back to our countries these ideas of having another culture, seeing things differently. And because we, of course, have a lot of information when getting together with other academics from other countries, even though we have a common ground in terms of our topics, we have different approaches. Of course, in Europe, maybe we are closer, but with UK, I'm sure we have different ways of approaching the problems, even for scientific or research problems. So I think it's a beginning of something. We are not very far. And I think that all we have built, including the networks of national Russell groups or whatever, is also a way to attract people to our country. I mean, the IDEX things, etc., is more to attract foreigners to France, for instance, than to open our universities to international blood, I would say. So there's still quite a lot to do.
I think that's really an important point about careers in Europe, and that's probably for me the main difference with the United States. Of course, there is the languages. That's a main issue. They don't have this problem in the US, but if you look at the US system, in fact, you have as many systems as states. But nevertheless, the US academic system is all over the USA. So if you can apply at Harvard or at Berkeley or at UCLA, and that would be about the same rules for the same discipline, because the academic profession and the discipline associations are very important in building the common norms for a single discipline. And we don't have that in Europe, I would say. We are not sharing exactly from one country to another the same sense of what science is, what the norms are, and this is still to be built. And again, when I look at the way our countries are thinking, when I look at the recent reform in France with the LPR, the Research Act, the recent Research Act, there is many things about careers in this act, and all of that is as if nobody had looked at what was going on in Europe in order to try to, maybe not to copy, because we don't have to imitate, but at least to make things compatible. And I'm not sure that what has been made is understandable, by someone coming from another European country. And that's what I mean by looking at the different career systems and trying to make them more compatible one with another. Not the same. I think that will be for a very, very long time. And I'm not sure that's very useful, but at least compatible. And they are still not very compatible. And that's the reason why when you go abroad and you come back, you're not in your system any longer, because you spend too many years abroad, and the system, the rules, the procedures are so different from one country to another. Still now, I think it makes the the feeling of being a European academic. And from my point of view, that would be really the goal to achieve, so that each academic in Europe will feel an European academic and not first a French or a UK or German academic. That's something that should be really worked upon by the different countries in order to try to improve that. And I think that would be much more powerful in terms of building something European than just putting institutions together. Because I think that a university which is not part of a European alliance, like UCL, could feel very European and could have European diploma and have a European spirit without being part of a larger cooperation. So that's, yeah. I was interested by what Alain said about what European means with these European universities, because that's something which is very important. What is the added value? And that's a challenge for them, for these universities, right? Let's see what they add. And that's, yeah.
Thank you. I want to just bring in somebody from the Q&A who's joining us remotely, Marina Pagliarello from UCL, who's got a question about the EUI alliances and private actors specifically. And she asked, do you foresee, specifically to Professor Berhetz now, the EUI developing a common governance role for private actors with reference to service to society or innovation? And if yes, what type of role in terms of cooperation and competition?
Thank you, Marina, for the question. It's not an easy question, but it relates more or less to what we heard before about careers. The issue is, what tools do you have, and not, I mean, don't mistake the tools and the goals, because that's the big mistake that everybody is doing. And that I heard some mistakes in this table today. Again, specifically to answer this question, as a background, I've been 6 years vice president of my university dealing with relationship with the economy. So I'm quite in favor of that, and I have a good experience. I must say, however, I don't see, but this is both in my individual university and in a European university, I don't see the issue of having the industry or the economy generally in the governance of the university. A university is an academic body. I mean, let's go back to the fundamentals. And you have to be associated, you have to involve, you have to listen, you have to relate, whatever verbs you want to use. But I mean, do you want an industrialist as the dean of a faculty or as your president? I'm turning back the question. More specifically, this issue, the question you're asking, is asked to any individual university in any country with differences in culture, differences in tradition, and differences in regulations. And I come back to the issue, what is the value added of this relationship on the European scale, considering what we just heard about the difference in regulations, which are very high in this domain, also between the countries. So that's very interesting. Could a European university come out with a solution of international collaboration on that field that could not be achieved by individual countries? That would be very interesting. But for this, you have to trust the universities, and it really depends of their scope. You have some alliances which are very, I would say, very specific in one or several economic domains. They will tailor-made, I would say, their relation according to those domains. And some others are multidisciplinary, comprehensive universities. So typically it will not be the same. So a very good question. Of course, I did not answer the question, but my main answer would be really a European value added. Otherwise, you come back to your national problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Do we have any other questions from the floor?
Hello, thank you everyone. I'm from Embassy of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I thought my voice should be heard today because this is a very important theme and all of you really raised very good points. Thank you for optimism. Thank you for skepticism. It's always very, from my point of view, very important and very true, both that we need international collaboration. My country is a study case in the world for a reason. Academics from our region started that war, they designed it, so academics are crucial. My opinion is that academics really are not the force that have this power to be superior above it all, but they need to intervene into this world, not just Europe, but they should be here to really save the world, because that's, I think, the only possible way. And as much as I heard today, I think we have power to do that. I will be short. This is mostly what I want to say. I could say much more, but with everything that is going on, I really think that if we connect these identities and values and these shared goals in a way, because we have the same goal, sorry, to have peace in the world and to have normal conditions to function in this continent and through the world. I think only with joint forces, with joint voices, with sharing the same goal, with this collaboration instead of competition, we can be there. These dialogues and conversation and connecting countries is the only way. And thank you all for being here and bringing hope back.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the end of the session, so if there are no other burning questions from the audience, I'd like to just invite each of our speakers to offer some closing reflections and perhaps just throw in a question of my own, which is we've rather taken as a given that everybody understands the value and importance of international cooperation. And although I think policymakers generally pay lip service to international cooperation, we've also seen lots of barriers surmounted in recent years, particularly in the UK, one might say. So I suppose one question which I would be interested in your reflections on is, are universities on an individual basis, through their networks, through their representative bodies, doing enough to articulate the value of international cooperation on a long-term basis? Perhaps Uta, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I'm getting the easy questions today. So I think it's a really interesting consideration that I was only about a year or so ago, I was in a meeting which my university's response to Brexit and the mitigation planning that we put in place was subject of discussion. And overall, I think UCL put a lot of effort into mitigation planning, and we had a lot of conversations around the country and interviews to try and ascertain what went well and what didn't go quite as well. But in that discussion, basically one question that was put forward was to say universities have been complete outliers in that they haven't really taken account of the public opinion, which is all in favor of Brexit, and by being so extremely on the pro Remain side, they have to some extent made themselves difficult partners to engage with for governments, and they should find a new basis on which to engage with partners. The reason I'm saying this is that I think sometimes the paradox is that by articulating so vociferously why international collaboration is important for us and why we need to continue to engage, was for a while perhaps even considered too old school, in the sense that apparently society had moved on and wanted to do a different kind of collaboration, which doesn't necessarily exclude international collaboration, but it has to be done in a different manner and in a different voice. I think over these years we've learned quite a lot, and going back to what I started with, I just wanted to say that the universities, I think, have tried to make their voices heard very much, even in a climate where they were not necessarily be looked at as representative of public opinion. And I wonder whether we have been able to do this without clearly trying to show that we're not open to change. I think what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of change happening, and we can do both. We can hold fast to the things we do truly believe in, and international collaboration with Europe is one thing, while at the same time experimenting with new forms. And I think that in this country, that is where the big challenge lies. It is at the moment a country which supposedly is very pro-research and pro-science, but I don't think it is one that entirely gets the international element of it. the way that I would like to see it defined. And I think there's still a huge amount of nuanced discussion that we have to make, and in which we both engage with those who make those decisions pragmatically and at the same time without compromising our own principles. That's very high level. I don't think you can derive any practical value from that, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Professor Berhetz, in closing reflections.
Well, thank you. It's very complicated to commit any closing reflections at that level of discussion. I would say, because we had this network, I really want to come back maybe to my basic feelings, is that, of course, universities can be wrong. They're always wrong, in fact, because we learn by trial and error. I mean, the universities are not factories of truth. We work by trial and error, but we're the only ones. And when we hear all our member states or Europe telling us the truth before they even demonstrate it, I think the universities are right. That's the method. We have to convince our society, our fellow citizens, that our method is good. Uta, you just spoke about this trauma of Brexit, and I wouldn't teach the slightest lesson to my colleagues of the UK about this. It's so complicated. But I witnessed it when I was chair of LERU, and we were discussing with the vice chancellor of Cambridge, of Oxford, and all, and what they were doing. And I mean, it was a drama for them, and I think they were right. As an academic, if tomorrow we avoided some very tragic governments in France, but if we ever get this type of government, the universities will be sacrificed. And so we have an issue on that. I think the universities are not the international, and to come back to your question on international, again, what I wanted to say by my little historical loop is that it's in our nature. We don't have to build an international policy. We are international. We are supported by our countries, and we love our countries, but we are international. We are plural by nation, and we are plural also by disciplines. And this is something that maybe we have, I'm sorry to say, to teach to our politicians sometimes that just don't understand it, depending on the country. But the trust invested in universities is very different. Even in Europe, I have a mixed feeling for Europe, and I have a mixed for France. Of course, Christine, I join you on your comments. But when you see, for example, Luxembourg or Singapore, what they decided to do with their universities, there are lessons to be taught, and they're doing it, of course, internationally. They're building from scratch. And how are they building their university? On an international standards with international personnel and international students. So I guess it's our genes. And but what we heard today, I'm always an optimist. I think we have a lot of mistakes. We have a lot of problems. We have a lot of issues to tackle. But I think it's still in universities that things are really moving. And again, you will hear tomorrow, but I was so surprised by the enthusiasm of the people that wanted to apply for a university, European University Alliance. And I'm very critical on the scheme, by the way, very, very critical on the scheme. But the enthusiasm was totally non-proportional to the amount of money given, to the issues. And so this means something. It means that people want Europe, they want international relations. I think that's something that makes me also, in a way, optimistic. But thank you again for organizing this meeting, and it was really fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christine, Vincent, do you have any closing remarks before we wrap things up?
A very, very short sentence. I completely agree that universities are per se international and that they need internationalization. We just have to be careful about the fact that competition could lead to closure of this cooperation, and that's something we should be really careful about.
Great. Well, I'm conscious we can go on for quite a lot longer than our allotted time. Did you want to come in? Or no? No. Okay. Yes. Yeah. But I just give the floor for 5 minutes to Dr. Mina Pham for any closing remarks.
It will be less than that. I just want to react to what has been said, and I really like the idea of the difference between network and alliances, and the idea of having added values, which without these added values, there is no need to cooperate in a way. And I think that there is not a unique model, and we have to remain creative. I think that even in the alliances, there are different types. There are targeting topics or methods, etc. I like also the idea that we should not make a confusion between the objectives and the tools. I think objectives are needed, tools are only a mean, a way. And at the end, I would like to come back to your comparison, Alain, between these cooperation, these alliances of universities and the ERC program, which is for everybody a success, because it relies on trust, and trust on the ideas of the scientists themselves, the academics themselves. And this is my take-home message. We have to be confident in the ideas of the scientists themselves, scientists, researchers, in the large sense.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So with that, thank you very much to all of our distinguished speakers. Thank you to you for coming, and to those of you who joined us remotely. The recording will be available on our website in the coming days. Thank you also to the UCL Faculty of Laws that made this hybrid event possible, which isn't always the easiest, technically speaking, and I hope you'll agree it's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you to you.
Thank you.